27 reports were made to CPS on behalf of this child, and now he's dead. The case of Dennis Boo Vaughn. Trigger warning, there are pictures included in this video. December 24th, 2019. Most kids were already tucked away in their beds, waiting on Santa to bring gifts. Well, not Dennis. He wouldn't get the opportunity to leave milk and cookies out. He wouldn't have the option of waking up and opening his gifts the next morning. Because by the evening of December 24th, he was dead. But it's been nearly 5 years and no arrests have still been made, even though the police know exactly who did this. So let's go back. Dennis and his siblings were placed with his grandmother after CPS deemed his mother an unfit parent. Immediately after his grandmother was granted guardianship, the reports to CPS began. Between the months of July and the following April, a total of 8 reports were made to CPS. Reports that described severe physical abuse, as well as the caregiver showing erratic behavior. One of the first reports filed in August of 2017 was made by law enforcement after an incident occurring at a campground. Police presence was requested as several witnesses observed Sherry Connor screaming at the 4-year-old Dennis, grabbing him by his neck and face, striking him several times. She dragged him by the arm and forcefully threw him into a tent. Cries, screaming, and yelling were heard from inside the tent that prompted several parties to call authorities as they feared the child might be in need of medical attention. And 4 days later, after the campground incident, DSS assigned a caseworker to follow up with the report. The caseworker did an interview at Sherry's home. The caseworker interviewed the children, the victims, in front of their grandmother where they could not speak freely. In March of 2018, that caseworker claimed the abuse allegations were unfounded and she closed the case. But CPS caseworkers neglected to contact the police officer who reported the incident to begin with. Caseworker also did not interview any of the witnesses at the campground who seen Sherry abusing Dennis. That caseworker needs to be arrested right now. Then, between the dates of April 17th and April 30th of 2018, the school would make 6 separate reports on behalf of the Vaughn children. He had multiple bruises on his face and neck. Here's one of the photos of the bruising on his face and cheek, along with scratches and abrasions on his face. Due to the contusion on his head, the school contacted his caregiver, his grandma, Sherry Connor. They advised her the boy would need a medical evaluation before he could come back to school, because they feared he had a concussion. So the grandma takes him to a hospital further away from their local hospital because red flags had already been raised at that hospital about previous injuries and abuse. So at the other hospital, the emergency room staff took notice of all the red flags on their own. During this hospital visit, medical records document not only the extensive injuries of the child, but Sherry's many stories attempting to explain away what had actually happened. Sherry blamed the injuries on the siblings fighting and arguing. She also claimed he was clumsy, he'd fallen down on the bleachers at school. But it was later confirmed that school don't even have bleachers. So a registered nurse was called upon to inspect the wounds in question, and in all 90 photographs of the abuse that were taken, it was documented very clearly in her report that the injuries were non-accidental. The child had clearly been beaten or grabbed by the face and ears. It was also noted the bruising on his small, bony arms were from rubbing the handcuffs he was confined to. In spite of this, CPS refused the mother's pleas to please get her children out of this home. CPS also refused any further investigation. Here's the black eye his mother reported to CPS, and it was ignored. Here's the bruising on his ear from slapping, pinching, or pulling. After seeing all this evidence, the caseworker still refused to investigate and left Dennis in her custody. So now we have multiple reports made to CPS by law enforcement, medical staff, school staff, witnesses, and relatives. In part 2, we're going to dig even deeper into the reports that were ignored by CPS. Because guys, trust me, you aren't going to believe this. You can also find Boo's mother here on TikTok. Go watch her videos. Her and her baby's story deserves to be heard. Boo deserves justice. They told everyone they were being SA'd by a relative, and literally no one would help them, including the police. And these 2 children would turn into 2 of the youngest convicted murderers in history. The sad case of Curtis and Catherine Jones, trigger warning. When I tell you the system failed these 2 children and all of this could have been prevented, I mean it. So Catherine and Curtis Jones were brother and sister. They were always very close, they took care of each other, and they had went through a lot together. Now on the outside, this family seemed like the perfect family. Beautiful couple, 2 healthy, beautiful children. But behind closed doors hid a gruesome reality that their parents, Curtis and Stacy, had a very violent relationship, and these children often witnessed their parents fighting. According to their mother, Stacy, the abuse began pretty quickly after she began dating their father, Curtis. Stacy said Curtis often had violent outbursts, which happened when she was pregnant with their first child, Catherine. The physical abuse became so bad that he caused her uterus to tear, and she gave birth to Catherine, who was born prematurely. About a year later, on May 31st, they welcomed their second child, Curtis. And both children would witness their father physically abuse their mother on a regular basis. The abuse became so violent, Stacy packed her things and left home in 1989. She was unable to take her two children, 4-year-old Catherine and 3-year-old Curtis, out of fear that her mother would reject the children because they were biracial. So she really thought she was doing what was best for the kids by leaving them there with their dad. So sometime after their mother left, another family relative on their dad's side moved in with them. And it turns out that relative was a registered schmegs offender. So this relative had been convicted of SAing his ex-girlfriend's 14-year-old daughter before he moved in with them. Not only was he a schmegs offender, but he also had a serious criminal history. Now when the schmegs offender relative moved in, he moved into Curtis's room, and soon after he began SAing Curtis. So sometime later, Catherine and Curtis visit their mother in Kansas, and they tell her about the abuse they've been enduring by that relative. So Curtis told his mother that he was being fondled and SA'd by this older man, and then Catherine admitted she too was being fondled and SA'd by that same relative. So an investigation was started, but it was quickly closed when Curtis changed his story. So in the meantime, Catherine and Curtis both continue to suffer SA and physical abuse with that relative. So the justice records show that 2 years later in 1996, another case regarding the Jones children was opened and an investigation was undertaken concerning Curtis sustaining a bruised and swollen eye. So now we've got the police and CPS in this investigation, and they're still not removing the children from the home. And they still haven't removed the predator from the home. So things would continue in the same abusive manner right on for a few more months. Their mother made numerous reports to CPS, but CPS never properly investigated. And now, September of 1998, a third investigation was opened. This time it was concerning 13-year-old Catherine. Catherine had run away from her home, and her teacher, being worried about her welfare, made the report stating concerns that Catherine was being SA'd. And this time, the police admitted to finding some indicators that Catherine was being SA'd. However, like the ones before, the investigation was short-lived. And get this, Catherine had told her father that this relative was SA'ing her, and her father took the relative's side. Catherine's father said he did not believe her. He took the side of the relative in question. By the time the investigation began, Curtis Sr. intimidated Catherine into lying to the officials and denying that the abuse had ever happened. So now we know for a fact their father intimidated and threatened Catherine to get her to change her story so the police would back off of this relative. So that tells me he was the reason why Curtis changed his story prior in the first investigation. Remember, we're in the third investigation now. So now, after being intimidated by her father, she was scared that she was going to be separated from her brother, so she changed her story, and now the investigation completely ended. Now, it's reported that the investigators warned their father to kick that schmegs offender out of his house. But of course, their father didn't listen, and he allowed the schmegs offender to continue living with them. So by this point, their father, their family, their friends, CPS, the police department, no one would listen and no one would help them. The only support these children had were each other, and they were both young children. So Catherine was around 12 or 13 years old. The breaking point for Catherine, according to her, was a few days after the last investigation was closed. She was taking a shower when the relative in question came into the bathroom, pulled open the shower curtains, and began pleasuring himself while staring at her. This traumatized Catherine. She huddled in the corner of the bathroom and sobbed until he was done. When he was done, he put 50 cents on top of the toilet and left the room. Catherine then wrote in her diary, "I'm going to unalive everyone." She was angry that her and her brother's cries were going unanswered by her father's girlfriend, the police, and CPS. So Catherine then came to the conclusion that her father, his girlfriend, and their abuser should all be unalived. Catherine eventually told her brother what she was going to do, and they came up with a plan. So to free themselves from torment by unaliving their abuser and eliminating the chance of this ever happening again, by unaliving the people they believed allowed the abuse to occur in the first place, on January 6, 1999, they set their plan in motion. Their father left for a little while and their abuser was not home, so they figured they would start off with their father's girlfriend, Nicole. They knew that evening they would be home alone with her and it would be easier unaliving these adults one person at a time. So 29-year-old Sonia Nicole Spikes sat at the dinner table working on a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle while the children went to retrieve their weapon. And that was when they found their father's 9mm semi-automatic pew-pew. Catherine took the first shot, hitting Nicole in her stomach. However, she dropped the pew-pew due to the rebound of the shot. 12-year-old Curtis then picked up the pew-pew and just went crazy. He hit Nicole and everything around her. But as soon as they finished, reality began to set in and they got scared. They realized they had just unalived someone, and that this wasn't some dream or fantasy in their head anymore. This was real. Catherine did her best to calm her brother down, and the pair set to work in an attempt to clean up the scene. They then dragged Nicole's body away from the dining room table and tried to use bleach to clean up the stains. After that, they did their best to try to make it look like someone had broken into the house. So they fled their house, and they stopped by the neighbor's house to let them know the sounds they had heard, the pop-pops, were just an accident. They had accidentally fired a weapon. Then they fled and hid in the woods nearby their home. What's sad is the only time police actually stepped in and really investigated this case is when Nicole's body was found. But if the police had stepped in the first 3 times and helped these children and removed them from the situation, they could have prevented all this. This would have never happened. I think every CPS worker, social worker, and police officer that was involved in this case should have been fired and arrested themselves. They neglected these 2 children so much that they thought they had to unalive someone to get away from this abuse. What were they supposed to do? So the children were found hiding in the nearby woods the next morning on January 7th, 1999. And they were facing serious consequences. They were the youngest people in that area that had ever been charged with murder. The police and the prosecution made them out to be monsters, even though it was the police who had investigated their family 3 separate times and knew about the abuse. Do you think any of those officers or investigators stepped up for them in court? No. Do you think their abuse was ever brought up in court? No. Do you think CPS stepped up on their behalf in court? No. Again, they were failed by the system during their trial. So now in August of 1999, they were 13 and 14 years old, and they were sentenced to 18 years in prison and life on probation. I just can't believe they got 18 years. Especially when people like Alexi Treviso unalived their baby with their own bare hands in a hospital bathroom are walking free today. These were children. They had nowhere else to turn, and that's my opinion. And I am so happy to report that they are both doing extremely well and have been since they were released. Since they got out, they have not been in any trouble at all. But sadly, they lost 18 years of their life, and their dad's girlfriend lost her life because no one would help them. They didn't let prison tear them down and turn them into monsters. There were countless reports made to CPS on behalf of these children, and no one stepped up to protect them. Had someone, anyone, especially CPS and the police department, stepped up and actually protected these kids, none of this would have happened. Arthur Shawcross was only sentenced to 25 years in prison for unaliving 2 small children. He barely pulled 14 years of that sentence before the parole board decided to release him on good behavior. And from there, he would go on to become one of America's most dangerous serial killers. Trigger warning, this video includes violence. So Arthur was born June 6, 1945, and his family quickly realized there was something very strange and disturbing about Arthur. He just wasn't like the other kids. Arthur was a lot bigger than the other children, and he had a reputation for being a school bully. One relative stated he would just walk up to you and body slam you into the pavement. He would get really excited if you cried out in pain. Most kids did their best to avoid Arthur at all costs, and you damn sure didn't want to be caught alone with him. He had a very violent temper, but that's not all. He loved torturing animals. I seen him skin a live fish just to see the insides, and I can't even tell you what he did to kittens and puppies. Trust me, you don't want to know. Several of the adults in our family were even afraid of Arthur. By the time he was a teenager, he had an obsession with girls. One relative stated he often acted like us girls owed him something, like we were just supposed to strip down and give him what he wanted, and if we didn't, he got extremely mad and became physical. So by April of 1967, Arthur was now 21 years old, and he was drafted into the United States Army. By this time, he divorced his first wife and gave up his rights to his son, but trust me, they dodged a bullet. That was the best thing that ever happened for them. Now, he only served 1 tour of duty with the 4th Supply and Transport Company of the 4th Infantry Division in Vietnam. But in reality, Arthur never served in a combat position. He would later tell stories about how he violently R-worded and brutally SA'd women and children while over there. And I mean, he was bragging about beheading people and violently ripping them apart and nailing their parts on trees. He often claimed that he engaged in a lot of cannibalism while in Vietnam. He loved telling these stories to anyone who would listen. Now, none of those murders can be confirmed, but after what he did here in America, I believe he did it over there too. Now, after his discharge from the Army, Arthur and his second wife, Linda, moved from Oklahoma to New York. But soon after moving, Linda divorced Arthur, and for good reason. After they were married, Linda began noticing Arthur's very disturbing behavior, and an Army psychiatrist even warned her that Arthur became aroused by doing violent things. So a regular intimate love life would do nothing for Arthur. He could not become aroused like that. So Linda did the smart thing, and she got the heck out of Dodge. Soon after Linda left Arthur, he was arrested for burglary and arson. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after only serving 22 months, he was let out early because he saved a correctional officer during a prison riot. So Arthur then returns to his hometown of Watertown, New York. May 7th, 1972, Arthur brutally R-worded and unalived his first known victim, 10-year-old Jack Owen Blake, after luring the boy into a wooded area in Watertown, New York. So Blake's body was not found until months later on September the 5th. And just 3 days before Blake's body was discovered, Arthur brutally R-worded and unalived an 8-year-old little girl named Karen Hill. In September of 1972, the body of 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill was found under a bridge. She had been R-worded and unalived. Police found mud, leaves, and other debris had been forced down her throat and inside her clothing. And neighbors remembered seeing Arthur with Karen in the vicinity of that bridge before she disappeared. Now, Arthur had a serious history of minor run-ins with local children. Arthur came under immediate suspicion. He was arrested in October, and he confessed to both killings. But, under the terms of a plea bargain, he agreed to reveal the location of Blake's body. In return, he was permitted to the plea agreement of a lesser charge of manslaughter in Karen's case. And then all other charges were dropped. And Arthur only received a 25-year sentence at Greenhaven Correctional Facility. The county district attorney, William McCluskey, said the reason he got this plea bargain was because, other than his confession to police, there was no direct evidence linking him to the Blake murder. McCluskey also suggested that Arthur could have argued at the trial he was under extreme emotional disturbance, and a jury may have been more likely to arrive at a verdict of manslaughter. They claimed they didn't have enough evidence to link him to these two murders to give him a harsher sentence. Then he turned around in the plea bargain and told them where Blake's body was. I just cannot believe that after only serving less than 14 years in prison, inexperienced prison staff and social workers concluded that Arthur was no longer dangerous and was no longer a predator. And they disregarded the prison psychiatrist who had assessed Arthur as a schizoid psychopath, and he was released on parole in April of 1987. Now, by now, Arthur's third wife, Penny, had divorced him. I can't believe this man had already been married 3 times. He first relocated to Binghamton, New York. Then he relocated to Delhi with his new girlfriend, Rosie Marie Wally. But soon, the Delhi residents became aware of Arthur's presence, and they were forced to move again. And they were once again met with hostility once the locals realized who he was and what he'd gotten away with. You can't blame these people. If you knew a child killer was living next door, would you feel safe? No. So these locals were freaking out every time they found out Arthur had moved into their neighborhood. But the parole board was paying for Arthur to move. So every time the locals figured out who he was, the parole board would have to relocate him again and again. And that came from the taxpayers' dollars. Now, by mid-October, Arthur and his girlfriend found more permanent housing in Rochester. And this is where Arthur's killing spree really began. Now, Arthur primarily targeted schmegs workers because he knew they were an easier target. He knew they were an easier target because usually they were dealing with addiction, homelessness, and if they went missing, usually there was nobody there to look for them. So Arthur would go unnoticed for the next 2 years, and he would unalive more than 12 victims, and that's just the ones that we know about. I have a strong feeling, and my gut tells me, he unalived more people than that. But they said they were doing everything in their power to catch this killer, and they just could not get a break. But many people look back at this case and they swear the police did not do enough because these victims were schmegs workers. So they didn't work as hard at catching the killer because these women were schmegs workers. The police department claimed they did everything they could do, from interviewing schmegs workers, their pimps, patrolling the streets, going undercover. Retired detective Robert Keppel has argued that the detectives investigating the case over-relied on the concept of modus operandi, at times searching for multiple suspects due to small differences in the profiles of each victim. Now, all of his victims were unalived in Monroe County except for one victim named Elizabeth Gibson. She was unalived in neighboring Wayne County. Now, on January 5th, 1990, the police were doing a surveillance of an area, and that's when they found the body of June Securio. While surveillancing this area where the body was found, police seen Arthur standing beside his car near this bridge using the bathroom. And because he was so close to where June's body had been discovered, they took him in for questioning. Now, at first, Arthur claimed he had nothing to do with any of these murders, even though the car he was driving matched the description given by several schmegs workers. So later, during his interview, the police asked several schmegs workers to identify a picture of Arthur and see if he was the man these missing women had left with on the night they went missing. And the schmegs workers identified Arthur as the man these women disappeared with. Now remember, this was a time when police were not relying on DNA. So they had to interview Arthur, interview schmegs workers, interview his girlfriend. They had to check his alibi on each night these women went missing. But finally, when the police threatened to arrest one of Arthur's girlfriends, the one he borrowed the car from, he finally confessed to the police he had unalived all these women. Now, there's an interview on YouTube of Arthur and a psychiatrist, and I suggest you go watch it. If you want to hear what a true narcissistic psychopath sounds like, go listen to that interview. He literally blames all the victims and does not take any responsibility for any of the murders. He claims this one talked back, that one slapped him, this one grabbed his wallet. This one was screaming too loud. That one was talking too much. Then he blames it on his mother SAing him when he was a child, which was never confirmed. He then blames it on the fact that he's in love with his sister and wants to unalive her because they had schmegs all throughout their childhood, and that was never confirmed either. He even blamed these children for why he unalived them. He never takes responsibility. He literally blames everyone but himself. So Arthur was held at Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York, where he was held until his death. He had no remorse. The 63-year-old died November 10th, 2008. This 55-year-old man was arrested for SAing his 9-year-old niece, who has special needs, but he says she SA'd him. He says he's the victim in all of this. Trigger warning. On August 8th, the 9-year-old victim, who is in a special education class, told her teacher that her private area hurt. Those concerns were relayed to a specialized teaching assistant, who accompanied the little girl to the school nurse. The school nurse determined the girl likely had a UTI, urinary tract infection, and made plans to call the child's mother about the issue. But on the way back to class, the teaching assistant asked the little girl if anyone had inappropriately touched her, and the girl replied back that her uncle did so when he wiped her. Now the teacher knew this was weird because this child was already potty trained. She could do it herself. The teaching assistant felt this was strange because she knew this girl could clean herself, so she asked her, "What did he wipe you with?" And the victim said, "With his bare hand." The teacher was appalled. The teaching assistant told police she immediately shared this horrific revelation with a special education teacher and started walking with the victim to another school office. The little girl said, "When he puts his blank in my blank, all I think about is going home." Hearing that, the teaching assistant said that she began to cry, but then she was comforted by the 9-year-old girl who hugged her and said, "It's okay." The teaching assistant dropped the little girl off with her teacher, took a break, went to her car, and cried again. The school quickly contacted Indiana CPS, and the little girl was taken to a specialized government center for a forensic interview with a CPS agent. During the interview, the girl went into detail about things that the uncle had did to her. So the CPS interviewer noted the little girl kept moving back and forth. It appeared that she was uncomfortable all throughout the interview. When they asked her where she was hurting, she said her private area. When they asked her why she was hurting there, she said she had been in pain ever since her uncle had schmegs with her. So on August 9th, the victim was taken to Peyton Manning Children's Hospital, where an SA examination was conducted. The next day, a nurse said that there were signs of trauma, but could not give the police specific information until the full report was complete. The day after that, the Richmond Police Department interviewed her uncle, Ronnie Black. He claimed he thought the allegations stemmed from an incident where he had to change her brother's diaper. Her brother is 13 and autistic and nonverbal. He claimed the little girl would not leave the room while he was undressing her brother, so he had to physically pick her up and remove her from the room. The lies these predators tell to cover their tracks is just unreal. Ronnie stated that the two children were his sister's children, and that the 13-year-old disabled boy lived with him full-time due to his medical condition. He said that caring for the two kids at the same time was too much for his sister, and that the little girl would stay with him on the weekends, and her mom would pick her up on Sunday. When they asked Ronnie if he had ever touched his niece inappropriately, he admitted to doing so, but using a medical glove while teaching her how to potty train, like how to properly wipe, because he claimed she was doing it improperly. But then Ronnie claimed that a little girl had undressed in front of him and climbed into bed. He claimed that she was naked, lying in the bed, and that she removed his shorts forcibly. He claimed she became violent and began hitting him in the head until he gave her O. He said that he put his blank into her blank. And then he said they had schmegs, which we all know is not schmegs. He SA'd her. Now initially, Ronnie claimed that he was asleep when this occurred, but then he admitted he was awake. For a while during the interview, Ronnie denied having an inappropriate relationship with his niece, but at one point during the interview, his story began to shift. Near the end of the interview, he finally admitted to 2 separate exact dates of when he SA'd her. Again, he called it having schmegs with her. I call it SAing her because that's what it is. I'm not going to let him sugarcoat what he did to her. Ronnie told the police he's the victim in this. She forced him to do this. She became violent and angry if he wouldn't do it. She's the one that come into bed and made him do these things. The actual audacity of this predator. What also scares me is her 13-year-old autistic, nonverbal, disabled brother lives with him full time. How do we know he hasn't SA'd him too? The biggest question I have in all of this, where is mom? Why is mom dumping her children off on her brother, especially when she knows they are both special needs? Ronnie says that his sister can't handle her children. Well, maybe CPS needs to find someone who can. Since mom isn't going to take care of or protect her children, then we need to find someone who will. So Ronnie was charged with 2 counts of child molestation Last I heard, he was sitting in jail under a $50,000 bond. I don't know how he only got 2 counts out of all of this. Listen, I had to leave a lot of details out. This is a very graphic story. Go online, read it, and then you'll be shocked. You'll be like, how did he only get 2 charges? Oh, because this is Indiana, and much like North Carolina, predators receive a light sentence, they get out of jail, and they go on to re-offend. They become repeat offenders, and they get more victims, they hurt more people, and it is time for our courts to step up. She unalived her stepdaughter because she had a potty accident. Trigger warning. August 1989. Alexandria Christine Soleski was only 5 years old. She and her older sister Dawn lived with their biological mother in California after their parents got a divorce. Now, their father Thomas was allowed visitation with his children, but under one condition. The children were not allowed around his new wife Roxanne, and that was for a damn good reason. So this decrepit piece of cat turd named Roxanne was a serial child abuser and very unstable. So in August of 1989, Thomas picked his 2 children up and he was supposed to take them on vacation. But instead, he kidnapped the girls and took them to Radcliffe, Kentucky to live with his new wife Roxanne and her 12-year-old daughter. As soon as they stepped foot through that door, Roxanne began abusing 5-year-old Alexandria. And for the next 2 months, the situation continued like that until October 26th. The day Alexandria was reported missing. But get this, her father and stepmother claim she was last seen playing outside the family's home on October 23rd, 3 days before they reported her missing. 3 days after she allegedly went missing, Tom informed his various neighbors that his 5-year-old daughter Alex was missing. Over the next few days, the Radcliffe Police Department, the military police from Fort Knox, and private citizens all searched for Alex. However, despite their efforts, she was never found, and all the while, this twisted couple claimed their daughter was missing, and they led the FBI on a 4-year search until the truth was finally revealed. Nissa, who feared her violent mother, finally plucked up the courage to tell the cops when she was 16 years old. In August of 1993, Nissa, who was Roxanne's biological daughter, contacted the FBI to discuss Alex's disappearance. Nissa informed the FBI that on October 25th, 1989, Roxanne, Alex's stepmother, had sealed Alex in a large plastic bag as punishment for wetting herself. Alex remained confined in that bag overnight and suffocated while her father slept in the same room. Nissa claimed Roxanne had tied the little girl up, bound her hands and feet, placed her in a bag, and left her there. Roxanne opened the bag to find that Alex had used the bathroom on herself, and this enraged Roxanne. Nissa said Roxanne closed the bag, she rolled that bag into a second garbage bag, and closed the second garbage bag and tied it shut. She was in her own filth, in darkness, and Roxanne was the one who closed the bag and left Alex there. Nissa said that her mother went on to abuse another child, leaving Alex in the bag for over a day. And the next day when she opened the bag, she found Alex dead. On tape, Tom admitted he had buried Alexandria's body in the woods in Otter Creek Park. He said, in this conversation, Thomas Soleski admitted to disposing of his daughter's body in October of 1989 and later returning to Kentucky from California to destroy Alex's remains. Based on Nissa's statements and that recorded conversation, the couple were indicted, charged, and convicted for murder, and they both got life without the possibility of parole for 25 years. And even to this day, Alexandria's remains have never been found. Roxanne would even go up for parole, and her own daughter would testify against her at that parole hearing. Fighting back tears in recounting the horrific prolonged death of her 5-year-old stepsister, the lone witness pleaded with Kentucky Parole Board members to keep the killer, her mother, in prison. Nissa said she's cold, unemotional, and will manipulate whoever she needs to get what she wants. But after hearing her daughter speak, Roxanne Soleski has waived her parole board hearing and elected to serve out the rest of her life sentence. Thomas has appealed his life sentence, but it was denied in 2002 and then again in 2018. So now we just got to make sure Thomas does not get released on parole. That monster should never get out. He is just as bad as Roxanne, especially when he refuses to tell police where his daughter's remains are. Her mother, her sisters, they all want her body returned back home so they can have a peaceful, private ceremony for her. But that's never going to happen if Thomas does not tell the police what he did with her remains. That monster has held that secret since 1989. He won't even allow this child to have a proper, peaceful burial. That's how greedy and selfish he is. And you can say, yeah, but Alicia, he's not the one who actually unalived her. He kidnapped his children from their biological mother, where they had a stable home, they had love, they had food, they had everything they needed. He took them to a monster, and he let her abuse them. And then he helped her cover up the evidence. And then he took his 5-year-old daughter's remains, and he buried them, He moved to California, made a trip back to Kentucky, and destroyed her remains to make sure they wouldn't get caught. He did not protect or defend his 5-year-old daughter. He only protected his wife and himself. And now Thomas wants sympathy. Oh, he didn't mean for this to happen. He didn't know Roxanne was going to do that to Alex. He wished he could go back and turn back time and change everything. Well, wish in one hand and crap in the other and see which one gets fuller first. But I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Thomas should be released on parole since he's already served over 25 years?